Hi, I'm Rachel. 3 hours before my dream wedding, my fiancé disappeared without a trace, leaving me humiliated in front of 250 guests at Chicago's most prestigious venue. What he didn't realize was that buried in my designer clutch was a document that would flip his betrayal into my greatest victory. By sunset, I wasn't just the abandoned bride crying in a wedding dress. I was about to become the wife of one of America's youngest billionaires. And the man who shattered my heart? He handed me the keys to destroy his entire world without even knowing it. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning started like every bride's fantasy. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse bridal suite at the Millennium Grand Hotel, casting everything in that perfect golden glow you see in magazines. I was Rachel Martinez, 28 years old, marketing, director for a tech startup, and supposedly 3 hours away from marrying the love of my life. The Lake Michigan shoreline sparkled below us like scattered diamonds, and the September air carried just enough crispness to make everything feel magical. I should have known something was wrong when my phone kept buzzing with texts I wasn't allowed to see. My maid of honor, Vanessa, who'd been my roommate at Northwestern and my closest friend for 8 years, kept snatching my phone away every time it lit up. "No phones on wedding day," she'd sing, but her smile looked strained around the edges. My bridesmaids, my sister Carmen, my cousin Isabella, and my college friend Whitney, exchanged glances that lasted a heartbeat too long. The kind of looks that said they all shared a secret I wasn't part of. Even my mother, Maria, seemed unusually focused on arranging and rearranging the white roses in my bouquet, her manicured fingers trembling slightly as she worked. She'd flown in from Phoenix 2 days earlier, and instead of her usual effusive excitement about everything wedding-related, she'd been quiet, almost careful with her words. When I'd asked her if she liked my dress during the final fitting, she'd simply nodded and said it was appropriate for the occasion. Not beautiful, not stunning, appropriate. The dress itself was a masterpiece that had taken 4 months to create. Custom Vera Wang, silk mikado with hand-sewn pearl detailing that caught the light every time I moved. The bodice fit like it had been sculpted for my body, and the cathedral train pooled behind me like liquid moonlight. I'd dreamed of this dress since I was 12 years old, sketching variations of it in the margins of my notebooks during boring classes. Now, standing in front of the ornate mirror in the bridal suite, I looked like the princess I'd always imagined becoming. But something felt hollow about the whole scene, like watching a movie of someone else's life. The champagne tasted flat on my tongue. The excited chatter of my bridesmaids sounded muffled and distant. Every time I tried to call my fiancé Ryan, someone would distract me with another detail that needed my attention. The photographer wanted more shots. The florist needed approval on the altar arrangements. The wedding coordinator had last-minute questions about the reception timeline. Ryan Torres and I had been together for 4 years, engaged for 18 months. We'd met at a networking event for young professionals in Chicago, where he'd approached me at the bar with a confidence that should have been cocky, but somehow wasn't. He was charming in that effortless way that made everyone in the room gravitate toward him, with dark hair that always looked perfectly tousled and eyes that seemed to hold secrets. He owned a successful digital marketing consultancy that specialized in luxury brands, drove a silver Porsche that he'd worked 3 jobs to afford, and had the kind of easy smile that made strangers trust him instantly. Our relationship had been like something out of a romantic comedy. Spontaneous weekend trips to Napa Valley, surprise dinners at restaurants I'd mentioned wanting to try, flowers delivered to my office for no reason other than it was Tuesday. He proposed on the rooftop of our apartment building during a snowstorm, with the entire city spread out below us looking like a snow globe. I'd said yes before he'd even finished asking the question. But lately, something had shifted. Ryan had been distant, distracted, working later hours and taking phone calls in the other room. When I'd asked about it, he'd attributed it to wedding stress and the pressure of expanding his business. He'd been landing bigger clients, taking on more ambitious projects, and the success seemed to come with an edge of anxiety I'd never seen in him before. Still, I'd chalked it up to pre-wedding nerves. Everyone said that was normal. As the morning progressed, that hollow feeling in my chest grew stronger. By 11 o'clock, I hadn't heard from Ryan at all, which was unusual for someone who typically sent me good morning texts that were small novels about how much he loved me. Vanessa kept insisting that it was bad luck for the bride and groom to communicate on their wedding day, but Ryan had never been superstitious about anything. He was the kind of person who walked under ladders just to prove they were harmless. The hair and makeup team worked around my growing anxiety with professional efficiency. My dark hair was swept into an intricate updo with delicate pearl pins that complemented the dress perfectly. The makeup artist, a soft-spoken woman named Claire who'd done my engagement photos, applied foundation with the precision of a surgeon, covering the stress breakout on my chin that had appeared 3 days earlier, despite my religiously maintained skincare routine. "You look absolutely radiant," Claire murmured as she applied the final touches of lipstick. "This shade of rose is perfect with your complexion." I wanted to feel radiant. I wanted to feel like the luckiest woman alive, counting down the minutes until I could walk down that aisle and promise forever to the man I loved. Instead, I felt like I was wearing someone else's life, playing the part of a happy bride while something dark and unnamed twisted in my stomach. The photographer, an energetic woman named Sophie who had shot 3 of my friends' weddings, captured every moment with artistic precision. She positioned us around the suite like we were models in a high-end bridal magazine, me adjusting my veil in front of the antique mirror, my mother fastening my grandmother's pearl necklace around my throat, my bridesmaids laughing as they held champagne flutes that sparkled in the afternoon light. But even Sophie seemed to sense the underlying tension. Her usual stream of cheerful chatter was more subdued, and she kept checking her own phone between shots. By noon, the anxiety had crystallized into something sharp and specific. I needed to hear Ryan's voice. I needed him to tell me everything was perfect, and that he couldn't wait to see me walking toward him. I needed confirmation that this strange, hollow feeling was just wedding day jitters and not my intuition trying to warn me about something I wasn't ready to face. "I'm calling Ryan," I announced to the room, reaching for my phone with determination that surprised everyone, including myself. Vanessa moved to intercept me, but I was faster. I grabbed my phone from the dressing table and stepped toward the bathroom for privacy. But before I could dial, the phone buzzed in my hand with an incoming text message. The sender was Ryan. The message was only 8 words long, but those 8 words shattered my entire world. "I can't do this. I'm sorry. Forgive me." I stared at the screen until the letters began to blur. I read it again, hoping I'd misunderstood, hoping it was some kind of joke or mistake. But the words remained unchanged, stark and final against the white background of my phone screen. My hands started shaking so violently that I nearly dropped the phone. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The bathroom suddenly felt too small, too airless, like the walls were closing in around me. I gripped the marble countertop to steady myself and forced my lungs to remember how to work. A follow-up text appeared. "Don't try to find me. I'll be in touch about arrangements." Arrangements. Like our 4-year relationship was a business transaction that needed to be efficiently concluded. Like the hundreds of people gathered downstairs waiting to celebrate our love were simply an inconvenience to be managed. Like I was a problem to be solved rather than the woman he'd promised to love forever. I don't remember walking back into the main room. I don't remember my phone slipping from my fingers and clattering onto the marble floor. The next thing I was conscious of was sitting on the velvet settee with my sister Carmen's arms around me, my carefully applied makeup streaming down my face in dark rivulets. The room erupted into chaos. My mother started making rapid-fire phone calls in Spanish, her voice rising with each conversation. Whitney began crying harder than I was, mascara creating abstract art on her cheeks. Isabella paced back and forth, in her lavender bridesmaid dress, muttering a string of creative curses that would have made our grandmother cross herself. The photographer discreetly packed up her equipment, understanding without being told that there would be no more pictures today. But Vanessa just stood there, perfectly composed, her makeup flawless, and her expression carefully neutral. She looked like someone who had been expecting this moment, who had prepared for it. The realization hit me like cold water. "You knew," I whispered, my voice hoarse from crying. "You've known all morning." Vanessa's perfectly contoured face didn't change. "Rachel, you're in shock. You're not thinking clearly. You've been acting strange all morning, keeping my phone away from me. Those looks you've all been exchanging." I stood up, the weight of my dress suddenly feeling like armor rather than a burden. "How long have you known he was going to leave me?" The silence stretched like a taut wire. Carmen stopped crying. Isabella stopped pacing. Even my mother ended her phone call and turned to stare at Vanessa. "Answer me," I demanded, my voice stronger than I felt. Vanessa smoothed an invisible wrinkle from her dress and finally met my eyes. "He called me last night. He was having doubts and he needed someone to talk to." "So you convinced him to abandon me at the altar?" "I convinced him to be honest about his feelings instead of going through with a marriage that would make you both miserable." Her voice carried a hint of defensiveness now. "Rachel, you two have been growing apart for months. Everyone could see it, except you." The betrayal felt deeper than Ryan's abandonment. This was my best friend, my maid of honor, the person I'd trusted with every secret and fear. She'd spent the morning helping me into my wedding dress while knowing it was all a performance, a cruel charade that would end in humiliation. "Get out," I said quietly. "Rachel, you're upset. Get out!" The words exploded from me with a force that surprised everyone in the room. "Get out right now." Vanessa gathered her clutch and wrap with the dignity of someone who'd been expecting this reaction. At the door, she turned back one last time. "Someday you'll thank me for this," she said. "Both of you will." After she left, the room felt like the aftermath of a storm. My remaining bridesmaids looked at me with expressions of pity and uncertainty, unsure whether to comfort me or give me space. My mother sat heavily in the chair by the window, suddenly looking every one of her 53 years. "What do we do now?" Carmen asked softly. I looked around the room at the debris of my destroyed wedding day. My phone lay in pieces on the high floor, where I'd apparently thrown it after reading Ryan's text. My bouquet was scattered across the coffee table, white roses and baby's breath crushed and wilting. My veil, which had taken an hour to pin perfectly into place, hung askew like a broken wing. But underneath the devastation, something else was stirring. Something that felt like anger but sharper. Something that felt like determination but fiercer. I walked to my purse, a small beaded clutch that matched my dress, and pulled out a folded document I'd been carrying like a talisman for the past 6 months. It was a contract Ryan had asked me to sign back in March, something he'd called a simple partnership agreement for an investment property we were buying together in Lincoln Park. He'd presented it as a romantic gesture, our first major purchase. As a couple, the place where we'd live after our honeymoon. But I'd read every line of that contract. I'd read it 3 times, actually, because my father had been a real estate attorney before his retirement, and he'd drilled into me the importance of understanding every document I signed. The contract wasn't just about the condo. It established me as a business partner in Ryan's consulting firm, with specific clauses about profit sharing, decision-making authority, and what would happen if either party breached their commitments. Ryan had been so focused on getting my signature that he'd never bothered to read the fine print himself. Or maybe he'd assumed I wouldn't read it, that I'd sign it because I trusted him completely. Either way, he'd made a critical error. According to Section 12 of the partnership agreement, if either party abandoned their committed obligations without proper notice and mutual agreement, the remaining partner would assume controlling interest in all shared assets and business ventures. Ryan thought he was walking away from a marriage. What he'd actually done was hand me legal control of his entire company. I smoothed the document across the dressing table and read it one more time, my tears finally stopping as the full implications sank in. Torres Digital Marketing Consultancy generated over $2 million in annual revenue. Ryan's client list included some of the most prestigious luxury brands in the Midwest. His business was his life, his pride, his entire identity. And now, it was mine. I looked at myself in the mirror, at my tear-streaked makeup and my crooked veil and my beautiful, expensive dress that would never serve its intended purpose. But underneath all of that, I saw something I'd never seen before. I saw a woman who had just discovered she was far more powerful than anyone, including herself, had ever realized. "Carmen," I said, my voice steady for the first time since reading that text. "Call Dad. Tell him I need his best lawyer friend, and I need them here in an hour." "Rachel, what are you thinking?" I turned away from the mirror and faced my sister, feeling something dangerous and electric coursing through my veins. "I'm thinking that Ryan just made the biggest mistake of his life, and I'm about to show him exactly how expensive that mistake is going to be." The abandoned bride was about to become something much more dangerous than a woman scorned. She was about to become a woman with nothing left to lose and all the legal ammunition she needed to win a war Ryan didn't even know he'd started. My father's lawyer friend turned out to be Margaret Chen, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s who arrived at the Millennium Grand Hotel wearing a Navy power suit and carrying a briefcase that looked like it had seen more courtroom battles than a war. Veteran, she took one look at me in my wedding dress, surrounded by the wreckage of my bridal suite, and her expression shifted from polite concern to predatory interest. "Show me the contract," she said without preamble, settling into the chair across from me with the kind of confidence that made me understand why my father had called her the best litigation attorney in Illinois. I handed her the partnership agreement, watching as her eyes moved rapidly across each page. Her face remained neutral, but I caught the slight upward twitch of her lips when she reached Section 12. After several minutes of silence, she looked up at me with something that might have been admiration. "Your fiancé is an idiot," she said bluntly. "This contract is ironclad, and he just triggered the breach clause in the most spectacular way possible. As of today, you own controlling interest in Torres Digital Marketing Consultancy." She paused, studying my face. "The question is, what do you want to do with that power?" The question hung in the air like smoke. What did I want? An hour ago, I'd wanted to marry Ryan and start our life together. Now, sitting in my ruined wedding dress with my makeup streaked down my face, I felt something darker and more primal, stirring in my chest. I wanted justice. I wanted him to understand the magnitude of what he'd thrown away. I wanted him to feel as small and powerless as he'd made me feel. "I want to know everything," I said. "Every client, every contract, every financial detail. If I'm going to own his company, I need to understand exactly what I'm taking control of." Margaret smiled, and it wasn't entirely pleasant. "Now you're talking my language. I'll need access to his business records, but as his legal partner, you're entitled to full disclosure. We can have a complete audit within 48 hours. While Margaret made calls to set the legal machinery in motion, I finally allowed myself to change out of my wedding dress. The zipper stuck halfway down, and Carmen had to help me work it free, both of us crying silently as we folded the beautiful gown back into its preservation box. I dreamed of saving that dress for my future daughter, of telling her the story of the magical day I married her father. Now it would live in my closet like a ghost, a reminder of the life I'd almost had. I dressed in black jeans and a soft gray sweater, tying my hair back in a simple ponytail. Without the elaborate makeup and styling, I looked younger, more vulnerable, but also more like myself. The bride was gone, replaced by someone I was just beginning to recognize. My phone, retrieved from the floor and miraculously still functional, despite its cracked screen, buzzed with a steady stream of messages. Wedding guests were arriving at the hotel, confused about the delay. The caterers needed to know whether to start serving cocktails. The band wanted confirmation about their start time. Each notification felt like a small knife twisting in my chest. "I'll handle the guests," my mother said, her voice heavy with exhaustion. "I'll tell them there's been a postponement due to unforeseen circumstances." "Don't lie for him," I said sharply. "Tell them the truth. Tell them Ryan abandoned me 3 hours before the ceremony and disappeared without explanation. I'm done protecting his reputation." My mother's face crumpled slightly, but she nodded. In all my 28 years, I'd never spoken to her with such cold authority. The woman who had raised me to be polite and accommodating, to smooth over conflicts and avoid making waves, was witnessing the birth of someone entirely different. As the afternoon wore on, Margaret's preliminary research began revealing cracks in Ryan's seemingly successful business empire. His company had been hemorrhaging money for the past 6 months, bleeding cash through a series of bad investments and overextended credit lines. The silver Porsche was leased, not owned. The expensive watches and designer suits were financed through credit cards that were approaching their limits. The confident, successful entrepreneur I'd fallen in love with was essentially broke, living an elaborate lie funded by borrowed money and desperate bravado. But more disturbing than his financial irresponsibility was what Margaret discovered about his recent business dealings. Ryan had been taking on increasingly questionable clients, companies with murky ownership structures and business practices that bordered on fraud. He'd been so desperate for quick cash that he'd compromised his ethics and possibly broken several laws in the process. "There's something else," Margaret said, her voice carefully neutral as she looked up from her laptop. "One of his biggest recent clients is Meridian Holdings. They've been paying him enormous fees for what appears to be very minimal work." She turned the laptop screen toward me, showing a series of invoices that made my breath catch. Ryan had billed Meridian Holdings over $300,000 in the past 4 months for strategic consultation and brand development. But when Margaret cross-referenced those invoices with Ryan's actual work product, there was almost nothing to show for it. A few PowerPoint presentations, some basic market research that looked like it had been copied from public sources, and a handful of meaningless reports filled with business jargon that said nothing substantial. "This looks like money laundering," Margaret said quietly. "Meridian is paying your fiancé huge sums for services that don't actually exist, which means they're probably using his company to clean dirty money." The implications hit me like a physical blow. Ryan hadn't just abandoned me at the altar, he'd potentially made me an unwitting partner in criminal activity. If law enforcement was investigating Meridian Holdings, my name was on legal documents that connected me to their operations. Ryan's betrayal wasn't just personal anymore, it was dangerous. "Can I get out of this?" I asked, my voice smaller than I wanted it to be. "Actually, his abandonment might be the best thing that could have happened to you legally," Margaret said. "The breach clause in your partnership agreement gives you the authority to immediately terminate any business relationships you deem unsuitable. You can cut ties with Meridian before you get dragged into whatever investigation is coming." Margaret continued her research, I found myself staring out the hotel room window at Lake Michigan, watching the late afternoon sun paint the water in shades of gold and amber. Somewhere out there, Ryan was probably congratulating himself on his narrow escape from marriage, completely unaware that he'd just handed me the tools to destroy everything he'd worked for. The irony was almost beautiful in its completeness. My phone rang, startling me from my thoughts. The caller ID showed my best friend from college, Diana, who was supposed to be flying in from Seattle for the wedding. "Rachel?" I just got your mother's message about the postponement. What's going on? I found myself telling the whole story, from Ryan's cowardly text message to Vanessa's betrayal, to Margaret's discoveries about his business practices. Diana listened without interrupting, occasionally making small sounds of sympathy or outrage. "So let me get this straight," she said when I finished. "He left you at the altar, but in doing so, he accidentally signed over his entire company to you? And that company is potentially involved in money laundering?" "That's the situation, yes. Rachel, honey, I know this is devastating, but you just dodged the biggest bullet of your life. If you'd married him, you'd be legally tied to all of this mess. Now you can walk away clean. Or better yet, you can take everything he cares about and burn it to the ground." The vindictive pleasure in Diana's voice should have shocked me, but instead it felt validating. For years, I'd been the peacemaker, the one who apologized first after arguments and worked to maintain harmony in all my relationships. But Ryan's abandonment had shattered something fundamental in me, revealing a capacity for ruthlessness I'd never known I possessed. By evening, Margaret had compiled a comprehensive picture of Ryan's business empire, and it was even worse than we'd initially suspected. Beyond the questionable Meridian Holdings relationship, she'd found evidence of tax evasion, fraudulent billing practices with several other clients, and a pattern of financial mismanagement that bordered on criminal negligence. Ryan Torres wasn't just a failed entrepreneur. He was potentially facing federal charges. The FBI has been building a case against Meridian Holdings for 18 months, Margaret informed me, scrolling through public court documents on her laptop. Money laundering, racketeering, conspiracy to commit fraud. When they move on Meridian, they're going to investigate everyone who's done business with them. Your ex-fiancé is going to be in serious trouble. But as Margaret painted this picture of Ryan's impending downfall, something else caught my attention. In her research, she'd pulled up information about other companies that had severed ties with Meridian Holdings in recent months, apparently anticipating the coming investigation. One name on that list made my heart skip: Blackstone Enterprises. "Tell me about Blackstone," I said, pointing to the screen. Margaret clicked on the link, and a corporate website loaded, featuring a photograph of a man who looked like he'd stepped out of a magazine spread about successful entrepreneurs. Adrian Blackstone was 35 years old, heir to a telecommunications fortune, and according to Forbes, worth approximately $8 billion. But more importantly for my current situation, he'd recently terminated a lucrative contract with Meridian Holdings, citing irreconcilable differences in business practices. "Blackstone Enterprises is clean," Margaret said, reading from the company's profile. "They've been cooperating with federal investigators, providing evidence about Meridian's operations. Adrian Blackstone has a reputation for ethical business practices and philanthropy, the complete opposite of your ex-fiancé, basically." I studied Adrian Blackstone's photograph, noting the intelligent eyes and the slight smile that suggested he was someone who didn't take himself too seriously, despite his wealth and power. He was handsome in an understated way, with dark hair that looked like he'd run his fingers through it, and a jawline that belonged in a Renaissance sculpture. But what struck me most was how different he looked from Ryan. Where Ryan's confidence had always felt performative, almost desperate, Adrian seemed natural and unforced. "Is he married?" I asked, surprising myself with the question. Margaret raised an eyebrow but obligingly clicked through to Blackstone's personal information. "Divorced 2 years ago, no children, currently single, according to the society pages." She studied my face with growing amusement. "You're not seriously thinking about rebounds already, are you? It's been 6 hours since your fiancé abandoned you." "I'm not thinking about rebounds," I said, though the denial felt hollow even to me. "I'm thinking about opportunities." The truth was more complicated than I was ready to admit. Something about Adrian Blackstone's photograph had stirred a reaction in me that had nothing to do with his wealth or status. He looked like someone who kept his promises, someone who understood that actions had consequences. After 4 years, with a man who turned out to be fundamentally dishonest, the idea of integrity was almost exotic in its appeal. As the evening progressed, hotel staff began dismantling the wedding reception that would never happen. I watched from the window as workers removed the centerpieces I'd spent months selecting, the flowers that were supposed to celebrate the beginning of my new life. The cake, a 3-tiered masterpiece covered in sugar flowers that had cost more than my first car, was being loaded into a van, destined for a homeless shelter where it would at least bring joy to someone. Carmen found me by the window, holding 2 glasses of wine from the bar we'd set up for the bridal party. "You should eat something," she said gently. "You haven't had anything since breakfast." I accepted the wine but couldn't imagine forcing down food. My stomach felt like it was full of broken glass, sharp with anger and betrayal, and something else I was afraid to name. Because underneath the pain and humiliation, I was beginning to feel something unexpected. Relief. "Can I tell you something terrible?" I said to Carmen, my voice barely above a whisper. "Of course." "I think I've been unhappy for months, maybe longer. I think I've been trying so hard to make everything perfect, to be the perfect girlfriend and fiancé, that I stopped noticing that Ryan and I weren't actually happy together." Carmen was quiet for a long moment, swirling the wine in her glass. Finally, she said, "Do you remember your birthday dinner last month, when Ryan spent the entire evening on his phone, dealing with some urgent client crisis?" I nodded. I'd tried to hide my disappointment, but it had stung to have my special day overshadowed by his work yet again. "You looked so sad, Rachel. You kept trying to get his attention, trying to engage him in conversation, and he barely looked up from his phone. Diana and I talked about it afterward, wondering if we should say something." "Why didn't you?" "Because you seemed so invested in the idea that everything was perfect. You talked about the wedding constantly, about how wonderful your life was going to be, but you never talked about how wonderful your life actually was. It was like you were planning a fantasy instead of a future." Her words hit me like cold water, forcing me to confront truths I'd been avoiding for months. Ryan and I had stopped having real conversations, stopped laughing together, stopped being genuinely interested in each other's thoughts and dreams. We'd been going through the motions of a relationship while both of us slowly checked out emotionally. The wedding had become a goal in itself, separate from the marriage it was supposed to represent. "Maybe Vanessa was right," I said, the admission tasting bitter in my mouth. "Maybe we would have made each other miserable." Vanessa was wrong. "About the way she handled it," Carmen said firmly. "Even if she thought Ryan was making a mistake, she should have talked to you, not conspired behind your back. She should have been loyal to you first." As we sat in the growing darkness, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. My heart jumped, thinking it might be Ryan with an explanation or an apology, but the message was from someone else entirely. "Ms. Martinez, this is Adrian Blackstone. I hope you'll forgive the intrusion, but I heard about your situation through mutual business contacts. I know we've never met, but I wondered if you might be interested in discussing a business proposition. I believe we may have common interests regarding certain problematic business relationships. If you're available, I'm currently at the Millennium Grand on other business. Adrian." I stared at the message, reading it 3 times before showing it to Carmen. Her eyes widened as she processed what she was seeing. "How does Adrian Blackstone know about your situation?" she asked. "Margaret must have been making calls about the Meridian Holdings connection," I said, my mind racing. Word travels fast, in business circles, especially when it involves potential criminal activity. But even as I said it, I wondered if there was more to it than that. Chicago's elite social circle was smaller than people realized, and news of a dramatic wedding cancellation at one of the city's most prestigious hotels would spread quickly through the networks of wealth and influence that connected people like Adrian Blackstone. The question was whether I was brave enough to find out what he wanted to discuss. 6 hours ago, I'd been a bride preparing for her happily ever after. Now I was a woman holding the legal keys to her ex-fiancé's empire, with a billionaire texting her about mysterious business propositions. I looked at myself in the mirror across the room, seeing a stranger wearing my face. My hair was mussed from the emotional roller coaster of the day. My eyes were red from crying, and I was wearing jeans and a sweater instead of the designer gown I'd planned to change into for the reception. I looked nothing like someone who belonged in the same conversation as Adrian Blackstone, but maybe that was exactly why I needed to have that conversation. Maybe it was time to stop trying to fit into other people's expectations and start writing my own story instead. "What are you going to do?" Carmen asked, watching the emotions play across my face. I stood up, smoothing my sweater and running my fingers through my hair. "I'm going to go downstairs and find out what Adrian Blackstone wants to discuss," I said. "And then I'm going to decide whether I want to be the woman who hides in her hotel room feeling sorry for herself, or the woman who turns the worst day of her life into the first day of something better." Carmen smiled, and for the first time all day, it reached her eyes. "There's my sister," she said. I was wondering when she was going to show up. The elevator ride down to the hotel lobby felt like descending into a different world. With each floor that passed, I felt the weight of the day's revelations settling into something resembling determination. By the time the doors opened onto the marble expanse of the Millennium Grand's main floor, I had convinced myself that meeting Adrian Blackstone was simply a business decision. Nothing more complicated than that. The lobby was a study in understated luxury, with soaring ceilings and crystal chandeliers that cast warm light over clusters of velvet seating areas. Even at 8 in the evening, it buzzed with the quiet energy of important people conducting important business. I scanned the space, looking for someone who matched the photograph I'd seen on Margaret's laptop, but before I could locate him, a soft voice spoke behind me. "Ms. Martinez?" I turned to find a man who was somehow both exactly what I'd expected and completely different from Adrian Blackstone's corporate headshots. He was tall, probably 6'2", with the kind of athletic build that suggested he actually used the expensive gym memberships that most wealthy men treated as tax write-offs. His dark hair was slightly disheveled, as if he'd been running his fingers through it, and his eyes were a striking shade of green that the professional photographs hadn't captured. He wore a charcoal gray suit that fit him perfectly, but didn't look like he was trying too hard, and when he smiled, it was genuine enough to create small lines around his eyes. "Mr. Blackstone," I said, extending my hand. "Thank you for reaching out. I have to admit, I'm curious about this business proposition you mentioned." His handshake was firm without being aggressive, and he held my gaze with the kind of direct attention that made me feel like I was the only person in the crowded lobby. "Please call me Adrian, and I hope you'll forgive me for the unusual circumstances of this meeting. I realize the timing is less than ideal." "Actually, the timing might be perfect," I said, surprising myself with my honesty. "Today has been full of unexpected revelations. What's one more?" Adrian gestured toward a quiet seating area in the corner of the lobby, away from the main flow of foot traffic. As we settled into the plush chairs, he signaled to a nearby server, who appeared with the kind of efficiency that suggested Adrian was a valued regular guest. "Would you like something to drink?" he asked. "I find that difficult conversations go better with good bourbon, but I understand if you prefer coffee at this hour." "Bourbon sounds perfect," I said, and meant it. The wine from earlier had worn off, leaving me clear-headed but still raw around the edges. Something stronger seemed appropriate for whatever this conversation was going to entail. As we waited for our drinks, Adrian studied me with an expression that wasn't quite sympathy, but wasn't businesslike either. It was something closer to respectful curiosity, as if he was trying to understand what kind of person I was without making assumptions based on the day's dramatic events. "I should probably start by explaining how I know about your situation," he said once the server had delivered 2 glasses of what was undoubtedly very expensive bourbon. My legal team has been monitoring businesses connected to Meridian Holdings as part of our cooperation with the federal investigation. When your ex-fiancé's company appeared on their radar this afternoon, my attorney called to give me a heads up. Because of the partnership agreement, I said, taking a sip of the bourbon and feeling its warmth spread through my chest. Exactly. The fact that you now have controlling interest in Torres Digital Marketing puts you in a unique position. Regarding the Meridian situation, Adrian leaned forward slightly, his expression becoming more serious. Rachel. May I call you Rachel? I think we might be able to help each other. I nodded for him to continue, though part of me was still trying to process the surreal nature of the situation. 12 hours ago, I'd been putting the finishing touches on wedding favors in my apartment, worried about whether the weather would cooperate for outdoor photographs. Now I was sitting in a luxury hotel lobby discussing federal investigations with one of the wealthiest men in Chicago. Meridian Holdings has been using small consulting firms like your ex-fiancé's company to launder money and legitimize questionable business practices, Adrian explained. They target entrepreneurs who are struggling financially, offer them lucrative contracts for minimal work, and essentially buy their silence about the true nature of the business relationship. And Ryan fell for it because he was desperate for money, I said, pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. Based on what my team has uncovered, yes. Torres Digital Marketing has been bleeding money for months, taking on debt to maintain the appearance of success. The Meridian contract was probably the only thing keeping the company afloat. The revelation stung, but not as much as it would have a few hours earlier. Learning that Ryan had been living a lie made his abandonment feel less like a personal rejection and more like the inevitable collapse of an unsustainable fiction. What kind of help are you talking about? I asked. Adrian took a thoughtful sip of his bourbon before answering. I need someone with legal access to Torres Digital Marketing's client files and business records. The FBI has been building their case against Meridian for over a year, but they need more evidence to make charges stick against the top tier of the organization. As Ryan's business partner, you have the authority to provide that evidence voluntarily, which would strengthen the prosecution's case significantly. And in exchange? In exchange, I can offer you something that your ex-fiancé never could. A legitimate business partnership with someone who actually honors their commitments. Adrian's green eyes held mine steadily. Blackstone Enterprises is always looking for talented marketing professionals, and from what I've researched about your background, you're exactly the kind of strategic thinker we need. The offer hung in the air between us like a challenge. It was generous to the point of being almost unbelievable, but as I studied Adrian's face, I didn't see any hint of deception or ulterior motive. He looked like someone who was accustomed to making bold moves and backing them up with action. You're offering me a job based on a few hours of research? I asked. I'm offering you an opportunity based on 3 factors, Adrian corrected. First, you have demonstrated integrity by agreeing to cooperate with a federal investigation instead of trying to profit from criminal activity. Second, you've shown remarkable composure under extremely difficult circumstances. And third, you have legal access to information that could help take down one of the most corrupt organizations currently operating in the Midwest. He paused, swirling the bourbon in his glass. But mostly, I'm offering you a chance to turn today's betrayal into tomorrow's victory. Ryan Torres thought he was escaping a commitment that would limit his freedom. Instead, he handed you the keys to destroy everything he cares about while building something better for yourself. The vindictive satisfaction in Adrian's voice should have concerned me, but instead, it felt like validation. For too long, I'd been taught that wanting revenge was petty, that being the bigger person meant absorbing hurt without fighting back. But sitting across from someone who understood that justice and revenge weren't always different things felt liberating in a way I hadn't expected. What would this partnership look like practically? I asked. You would join Blackstone Enterprises as Director of Strategic Marketing, reporting directly to me. Your first project would be helping our legal team organize and analyze the evidence from Torres Digital Marketing. After that, you'd have significant autonomy to develop marketing strategies for our various business interests. Adrian leaned back in his chair, watching my reaction carefully. The salary would be 3 times what you were making at your previous position, plus equity participation and performance bonuses. The financial details were staggering, but what struck me more was the title he'd mentioned. Director of Strategic Marketing was the kind of position I'd dreamed of reaching by the time I was 35. Ryan had always dismissed my career, ambitions as unrealistic, suggesting that I should be content with my current role and focus on supporting his business instead of building my own success. There's something else, Adrian continued. Meridian Holdings has been targeting other small consulting firms and marketing agencies throughout the region. If we can expose their operation, we'll potentially save dozens of businesses from the kind of financial and legal destruction that your ex-fiancé is facing. The idea of turning my personal catastrophe into something that could help other people was appealing in a way that surprised me. For years, I'd focused on building a perfect life for myself, measuring success by personal milestones like engagement rings and wedding venues. The possibility of doing something that mattered beyond my own happiness felt like discovering a new dimension of possibility. I need to ask you something, I said, meeting Adrian's gaze directly. Why are you really doing this? You could hire any marketing director you wanted, and you probably have lawyers who could get access to Ryan's records through subpoenas. Why go out of your way to help someone you've never met? Adrian was quiet for a long moment, considering his answer. When he spoke, his voice carried a note of something personal, almost vulnerable. 2 years ago, I went through a very public divorce. My ex-wife had been having an affair with my business partner, and they'd been planning to leave me and start their own company using proprietary information they'd stolen from Blackstone Enterprises. He took a larger sip of bourbon before continuing. The betrayal was devastating, but what hurt more was how alone I felt in the aftermath. Everyone in my social circle knew what was happening, but no one thought to warn me or offer support. "I'm sorry," I said, and meant it. The idea of Adrian, confident, successful Adrian, feeling abandoned and betrayed made something twist in my chest. The point is, I know what it feels like to have people you trust turn against you. I know what it's like to feel like the ground has shifted beneath your feet, and you can't trust your own judgment anymore. He looked directly at me. But I also know what it feels like to rebuild from that destruction and create something better than what you lost. The honesty in his admission was disarming. Here was a man who could have anything he wanted, who commanded respect and wielded enormous influence, and he was sharing his most painful experience with a stranger because he recognized something familiar in her situation. "How do I know you're not just as manipulative as Ryan was?" I asked, though the question felt like testing a theory rather than expressing genuine doubt. "You don't," Adrian said simply. "But you can start small and see how I handle the commitments I make. Trust has to be earned, and I'm willing to do the work." The contrast with Ryan's approach was stark. Ryan had asked for my trust as if it were his due, expecting me to sign documents and make commitments based on his promises and assurances. Adrian was acknowledging that trust was fragile and valuable, something that required consistent action to maintain. My phone buzzed with a text message, and I glanced down to see Ryan's name on the screen. My stomach clenched as I read his words. "I know you're angry, but please don't do anything rash. We can work this out. I made a mistake." The timing was almost laughably perfect. Just as I was considering a future that didn't revolve around fixing Ryan's problems and accommodating his limitations, he was reaching out to pull me back into his orbit of dysfunction and disappointment. "Bad news?" Adrian asked, noticing my expression. "Actually, I think it might be the opposite," I said, showing him the text. "Perfect timing for perspective. Adrian read the message and raised an eyebrow. Classic manipulation tactic. Create a crisis. Disappear until the other person is desperate, then return with the implication that you're being generous by offering a second chance. Is that what your ex-wife did? Almost exactly. She left me, moved in with my business partner, and then tried to come back 6 months later when their relationship imploded and the company they'd started together failed. Adrian's smile was sardonic. She was very surprised when I'd moved on to better things. I looked at Ryan's text message again, seeing it with new clarity. He wasn't apologizing because he'd realized he'd made a mistake. He was panicking because he'd discovered the consequences of his actions. Margaret's investigation had probably triggered alerts in his financial monitoring systems, showing him that someone was examining his business records and client relationships. "What did you text back to your ex-wife?" I asked. "Nothing," Adrian said. "I've found that the most powerful response to manipulation is dignified silence. It drives them crazy because they can't predict or control your reaction." I deleted Ryan's message without responding and tucked my phone back into my purse. The action felt symbolic, like closing a door I'd been afraid to shut. "So," I said, meeting Adrian's eyes, "if I were to consider your proposition, what would the next steps look like?" Adrian's smile was genuine this time, reaching his eyes in a way that made me understand why he was successful at more than just making money. "Tomorrow morning, you meet with my legal team to begin organizing the evidence transfer. By afternoon, we'll have a formal employment contract drawn up for your review. And by the end of the week, you'll be working from an office that doesn't remind you of anything connected to your previous life." That fast? When you've made a decision based on solid reasoning and clear goals, there's no benefit to moving. "Slowly," Adrian said. "Hesitation just gives other people time to create complications." As if summoned by his words, my phone rang. The caller ID showed Margaret Chen's name, and I answered quickly, wondering what new development had emerged in the few hours since we'd last spoken. "Rachel, we have a problem," Margaret said without preamble. "Ryan's filed an emergency injunction, claiming that you forged his signature on the partnership agreement. He's trying to block your access to the business records and freeze the company's assets." The shock of Ryan's counterattack hit me like cold water. Even though Adrian had warned me about manipulation tactics, I hadn't expected Ryan to escalate to outright lies and legal warfare quite so quickly. "Can he do that?" I asked. "He can try, but he's going to have a hard time proving forgery when I have 3 witnesses who watched you both sign the document, plus notarized copies and photographic evidence from the signing ceremony." Margaret's voice carried the satisfaction of a lawyer who'd anticipated exactly this move. "But it does mean we need to move faster than we'd planned. I need you to authorize the document transfer tonight, before his injunction hearing tomorrow morning." I looked at Adrian, who had clearly overheard enough of the conversation to understand what was happening. He nodded encouragingly, as if this development was merely an expected complication rather than a crisis. "Do it," I said to Margaret. "Transfer everything to Adrian Blackstone's legal team tonight. I want Ryan to wake up tomorrow morning and discover that he's not just lost his business. He's lost any leverage he thought he had to manipulate me." After I hung up, Adrian raised his bourbon glass in a small toast. "To partnerships based on mutual respect rather than deception," he said. "To new beginnings," I replied, clinking my glass against his. As we finished our drinks, Adrian walked me back to the elevator, his hand resting lightly on my lower back in a gesture that was protective without being possessive. The touch sent an unexpected warmth through me, a reminder that I was still a woman with desires and attractions that existed separately from my relationship with Ryan. "Rachel," Adrian said as we waited for the elevator, "I want you to know that whatever happens with the business partnership, I'm glad we met tonight. You're not at all what I expected." "What did you expect?" "Someone broken, someone who needed to be rescued." He smiled, and there was something almost admiring in his expression. Instead, I met someone who was ready to rescue herself and just needed the right opportunity. The elevator arrived, and as I stepped inside, I felt like I was ascending toward a future I couldn't have imagined 24 hours earlier. Ryan had thought he was escaping a life that felt too small for his ambitions. Instead, he'd freed me to discover that my own ambitions were far larger than I'd ever dared to believe. By the time I reached my floor, I was already planning my outfit for tomorrow's meeting with Adrian's legal team. Something professional but confident, suitable for a woman who was about to take control of her own destiny in ways that would have terrified the person she'd been that morning. The abandoned bride was transforming into something far more dangerous, a woman who understood her own worth and refused to settle for anything less than she deserved. The Blackstone Enterprises headquarters occupied 30 floors of a gleaming tower in Chicago's financial district, its glass and steel facade reflecting the morning sun like a beacon of corporate power. As I approached the building's impressive entrance, wearing a navy blazer and matching skirt that projected confidence, I was still working to feel internally. I caught my reflection in the polished surfaces and barely recognized the woman staring back at me. 24 hours ago, I'd been Rachel Martinez, the accommodating fiancé who organized her life around someone else's dreams and limitations. Today, I was someone entirely different. A woman walking into a billionaire's corporate empire as an equal partner rather than a supplicant. The transformation felt both thrilling and terrifying, like learning to fly while jumping off a cliff. The lobby was an exercise in understated magnificence, with marble floors that gleamed like mirrors and abstract sculptures that probably cost more than most people's houses. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Adrian's office as I signed the final document that would transfer all of Ryan's business records to the FBI's investigation team. My hand was steady as I wrote my name, though my heart raced with the magnitude of what I was doing. With each signature, I was dismantling the empire that Ryan had built on lies and desperation, brick by brick. Adrian stood behind his massive, mahogany desk, watching the process with the focused attention of someone who understood that decisive moments required witnesses. His office was a study in controlled luxury, leather-bound books that looked actually read rather than decorative, artwork that suggested personal taste rather than professional staging, and a view of Lake Michigan that stretched to the horizon, like a promise of infinite possibilities. "That's the last one," said Jennifer Walsh, Adrian's head legal counsel, gathering the documents into a neat stack. Jennifer was a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s with prematurely gray hair and the kind of no-nonsense efficiency that made me understand why Adrian trusted her with his most sensitive business matters. "The FBI team will have everything they need by noon." "How long before they move on Meridian Holdings?" I asked, trying to keep the anticipation out of my voice. "Days, not weeks," Jennifer replied. "They've been waiting for this level of documentary evidence for months. Your ex-fiancé essentially handed them a roadmap to Meridian's entire money laundering operation." The irony wasn't lost on me. Ryan's betrayal had been intended to free him from commitments and complications. But instead, he'd trapped himself in a web of criminal liability that would follow him for years. Every selfish decision he'd made had created the very cage he'd been trying to escape. Adrian moved to stand beside my chair, his presence warm and reassuring without being overwhelming. Over the past 12 hours, I'd begun to understand that his confidence wasn't the performative kind that Ryan had always projected. Adrian's certainty came from competence rather than compensation, from actual achievements rather than elaborate fiction. "There's something else we need to discuss," Adrian said, his voice carrying a note of careful formality. "Jennifer's background research turned up some information about your personal situation that we thought you should know about immediately." Jennifer opened a different file folder and placed a photograph on the desk in front of me. It showed Ryan and Vanessa together at what appeared to be an expensive restaurant, their heads close together in intimate conversation, The timestamp on the photo indicated it had been taken 3 weeks before my wedding. We had a private investigator doing routine background checks on all of Ryan's associates as part of our due diligence for the FBI cooperation, Jennifer explained. These photos weren't specifically requested, but they were part of the surveillance package we received. I studied the image, noting the way Vanessa's hand rested on Ryan's arm, the way they looked at each other with an intensity that had nothing to do with casual friendship. The betrayal cut deeper than I'd expected, not because I still had feelings for Ryan, but because it confirmed that the two people I'd trusted most had been conspiring against me for weeks. There are more photos, Jennifer said gently. They show a pattern of meetings over the past 2 months, hotel visits, private dinners, shopping trips where they appeared to be selecting items together. Adrian's jaw tightened as he looked at the photographs. They were planning this abandonment for weeks, probably timing it to cause maximum emotional damage while minimizing Ryan's legal exposure. The calculation behind their betrayal was breathtaking in its cruelty. They hadn't just decided to be together. They'd orchestrated an elaborate deception designed to humiliate me as publicly as possible while making themselves feel justified in their actions. By framing Ryan's abandonment as a last-minute crisis of conscience rather than a premeditated affair, they'd positioned themselves as tragic lovers forced apart by circumstances rather than selfish cowards who'd chosen deception over honesty. "I want copies of everything," I said, my voice steady despite the fury building in my chest. "Every photo, every timestamp, every piece of evidence that shows how long they've been lying to me." "Rachel," Adrian said carefully, "what are you planning to do with this information?" "I'm planning to make sure they understand that actions have consequences," I replied. "Vanessa works for Morrison & Associates, one of the most prestigious PR firms in the city. Her clients include several high-profile politicians and business leaders who value discretion and moral character. I doubt they'd appreciate learning that their account manager has been conducting a secret affair with a man under federal investigation for money laundering." Jennifer smiled with what might have been admiration. "That's a remarkably strategic approach to personal revenge." "It's not revenge," I corrected. "It's justice. They chose to destroy my reputation and humiliate me publicly. Now they get to experience the same level of exposure and consequences." Adrian was quiet for a moment, studying my face with an expression I couldn't quite read. Finally, he said, "You're not the same woman I met yesterday." "No, I'm not. Yesterday's woman would have absorbed this betrayal quietly and blamed herself for not being enough to keep Ryan faithful. Today's woman understands that some people don't deserve protection from the consequences of their own choices." The transformation felt seismic, like tectonic plates shifting deep beneath the surface of my identity. For 28 years, I'd been taught that forgiveness was always noble, that being the bigger person meant accepting less than I deserved. But sitting in Adrian's office, surrounded by evidence of betrayal and manipulation, I finally understood that some situations didn't call for forgiveness, they called for accountability. Adrian's phone buzzed with an incoming call, and he glanced at the screen before answering. "Margaret, what's the update on Ryan's injunction hearing?" I could hear Margaret's voice through the speaker, crisp with professional satisfaction. "Total failure. The judge threw out his forgery claims within 5 minutes and sanctioned his lawyer for filing frivolous paperwork. Ryan's now facing contempt of court charges in addition to his other problems." "Any word on his current location?" Adrian asked. "He's holed up in a downtown hotel under a false name, but the FBI knows exactly where he is. They're waiting for the Meridian arrests to go down before they pick him up. Apparently, they want to see if he'll try to flee or contact his co-conspirators." After hanging up, Adrian turned back to me with an expression that combined respect and something warmer. "Your ex-fiancé just went from bad decision-maker to federal fugitive in record time. The man has a genuine talent for making every situation worse." "It's almost impressive," I agreed. "If he'd just disappeared quietly, He might have avoided criminal charges. Instead, he's basically confessed to fraud by trying to block the evidence transfer. Jennifer began packing up her files, but before leaving, she turned to me with a question that felt loaded with implications. Rachel, I hope you don't mind me asking, but what are your long-term plans? I know Adrian offered you a position here, but someone with your strategic thinking abilities could write her own ticket anywhere. The question caught me off guard because I realized I hadn't thought beyond the immediate satisfaction of watching Ryan's empire crumble. Yesterday, my future had been mapped out in careful detail: marriage, suburban house, children, gradual career advancement within safely conventional parameters. Today, those plans felt like someone else's dreams, borrowed goals that had never really belonged to me. I think I'm still figuring that out, I said honestly. 24 hours ago, I thought I wanted security and predictability. Now I'm discovering I might actually thrive on challenge and uncertainty. Adrian mentioned that you're brilliant at strategic marketing, Jennifer continued. Have you ever considered starting your own consulting firm? With your experience and his backing, you could be running a major operation within 2 years? The suggestion was intoxicating in its ambition. I'd always assumed that entrepreneurship was for people braver and more connected than myself, people who could afford to take risks and weather failures. But sitting in this office, having just dismantled one business empire and walked into partnership with another, those assumptions felt like artifacts from a smaller version of myself. I've never seriously considered it, I said. But then again, I've never seriously considered a lot of things that suddenly seem possible. Adrian's phone buzzed again, this time with a text message that made his expression shift to something more urgent. The FBI is moving on Meridian Holdings right now. Simultaneous raids on their offices, executive homes, and associated businesses. They're estimating at least 15 arrests by the end of the day. The news sent a thrill of vindication through my system. Somewhere across the city, the corrupt organization that had preyed on desperate business owners was being systematically dismantled by federal agents armed with evidence that Ryan had unwittingly provided. His betrayal of me had become their destruction. A perfect circle of consequences that felt almost poetic in its justice. What happens to Ryan now? I asked. That depends on how cooperative he decides to be, Jennifer said. If he provides testimony against Meridian's leadership, he might avoid the worst of the criminal penalties. If he tries to protect them or play innocent, he's looking at serious federal time. Knowing Ryan, he'll probably try to charm his way out of responsibility and end up making everything worse, I said. He's never been able to resist the temptation to talk his way out of trouble. Adrian laughed, a sound that was warmer and more genuine than his professional demeanor usually revealed. You know him well. I thought I did. It turns out I knew the performance he was giving, not the person underneath. I paused, considering how to articulate the realization that had been building since yesterday. I think I spent 4 years in love with potential rather than reality, with who I hoped he could become rather than who he actually was. That's a common mistake, Adrian said, his voice gentler than before. I made the same error with my ex-wife. I was so invested in our shared future that I ignored increasingly obvious signs that she didn't actually want the same things I did. The admission created a moment of unexpected intimacy between us, a recognition of shared experience that went beyond business partnerships and professional courtesy. For the first time since meeting him, I saw Adrian not as the intimidating billionaire entrepreneur, but as someone who had also been betrayed by people he'd trusted, someone who understood the particular pain of discovering that love didn't guarantee loyalty. Can I ask you something personal? I said. Of course. When you found out about your ex-wife's affair, what was the worst part? The betrayal itself, or realizing how long you'd been living in a fantasy? Adrian was quiet, for a long moment, looking out at the lake while he considered his answer. The worst part was realizing that everyone around me had known what was happening and chosen not to tell me. I felt like an actor in a play where everyone else knew the script except me. That's exactly how I felt yesterday, like I was the only person who didn't know my life was a performance. But here's what I learned, Adrian continued, turning back to face me. The people who let you live in a fantasy aren't protecting you. They're protecting themselves from having difficult conversations. Real friends, real partners, they tell you the truth even when it hurts. The observation hit me with surprising force, making me realize that my relationships had been built on a foundation of convenient lies and comfortable avoidance. Ryan had never challenged me to grow or think bigger. Vanessa had never pushed me to question whether I was settling for less than I deserved. Even my family had encouraged me to be grateful for Ryan's attention rather than asking whether he actually made me happy. I don't think I've ever had a relationship based on complete honesty, I said, the admission feeling both liberating and terrifying. Most people haven't, Adrian replied. It's rare to find someone brave enough to handle the truth about who you really are, including the parts that aren't particularly admirable. Something in his tone made me look at him more closely, studying the way his expression had shifted to something more vulnerable and less controlled. Are you speaking hypothetically, or is this about someone specific? Hypothetically, he said, but the slight smile that accompanied his answer suggested there was more to the story than he was ready to share. My phone rang, interrupting the moment, and I glanced down to see my sister Carmen's name on the screen. I answered quickly, wondering what new crisis had developed in the few hours since I'd left the hotel. Rachel, thank God you answered, Carmen said, her voice tight with stress. Vanessa just showed up at the hotel looking for you. She's in the lobby demanding to talk to you about clearing the air and making a scene when the front desk won't. Give her your room number. The audacity was breathtaking. After weeks of deception and betrayal, Vanessa was apparently ready to position herself as the reasonable party seeking reconciliation. The timing wasn't coincidental. She'd probably heard about Ryan's legal troubles and realized that her secret affair was about to become very public knowledge. Tell her I'm not available for conversation, I said. And if she wants to discuss anything with me, she can do it through my attorney. She's saying that you're being dramatic and that this whole situation is just a misunderstanding, Carmen continued. She actually used the phrase, blown out of proportion. Adrian gestured for my attention and mouthed, speakerphone. I switched the call to speaker mode, and he leaned forward with interest. Carmen, this is Adrian Blackstone. I'm Rachel's business partner. Could you ask Vanessa if she'd like to discuss her understanding of the situation with the private investigator who's been documenting her movements for the past month? There was a pause on the other end of the line, followed by Carmen's slightly odd voice. Oh my God, Rachel, you didn't tell me you had a private investigator. I didn't, I said. Adrian's legal team discovered the evidence as part of their background research. Tell Vanessa that if she'd like to see photographs of her secret restaurant dates and hotel visits with Ryan, I'd be happy to arrange a viewing. She just went completely white, Carmen reported with obvious satisfaction. I think she's leaving. Now, yes, she's practically running toward the exit. After I hung up, Adrian was looking at me with something that might have been admiration. You're getting quite good at strategic intimidation. I'm learning that the truth is usually the most effective weapon, I replied. People can argue with accusations, but they can't argue with photographs. Speaking of which, Adrian said, Jennifer left something for you before she went to coordinate with the FBI team. He handed me a sealed envelope with my name written in elegant script across the front. Inside was a formal job offer from Blackstone Enterprises, complete with salary details that made my breath catch, equity participation that would make me wealthy within 5 years, and a title that represented everything I'd ever hoped to achieve professionally. But more than the financial terms, the offer represented something I'd never had before. A partnership with someone who saw my potential and wanted to help me develop it rather than containing it. This is incredibly generous, I said, looking up at Adrian. Almost too generous. What aren't you telling me about why you're willing to invest so much in someone you've known for less than 24 hours? Adrian leaned back in his chair, his expression becoming more serious. There are 2 reasons, one professional and one personal. Professionally, I believe you're going to be extraordinarily successful, and I want Blackstone Enterprises to benefit from that success. But personally? He paused, as if choosing his words carefully. I've spent the past 2 years learning to trust my instincts about people again, and my instincts tell me that you're someone worth betting on. The honesty in his admission created a flutter of something warm and dangerous in my chest. This wasn't just a business partnership anymore. It was something more complex and potentially more rewarding. Adrian wasn't just offering me a job. He was offering me a chance to discover who I could become with the right support and opportunities. What if I turn out to be a disappointment? I asked. What if you turn out to be exactly as extraordinary as I think you are? He countered. The question hung in the air between us like a challenge and a promise. Outside the office windows, Chicago spread out below us like a kingdom waiting to be conquered, full of possibilities I was just beginning to imagine. Ryan's betrayal had been intended to diminish me, to leave me smaller and more dependent. Instead, it had freed me to discover reserves of strength and ambition I'd never known I possessed. I accept your offer, I said, extending my hand to Adrian. Partners? Partners, he agreed, taking my hand in both of his. The handshake lasted longer than strictly professional, and when he finally released me, I felt like I was signing my name to a future that belonged entirely to me. By the time I left Blackstone Enterprises that afternoon, Ryan Torres was in federal custody, Meridian Holdings was being dismantled by teams of FBI agents, and I was the newest executive at one of Chicago's most successful companies. The woman, who had woken up yesterday morning as an abandoned bride, was ending the day as someone who couldn't be abandoned by anyone, because she belonged entirely to herself. The transformation was complete, but the story was just beginning. 3 months later, I stood in the penthouse conference room of Blackstone Enterprises, watching the Chicago skyline sparkle in the late afternoon sun as my team presented our quarterly marketing results to the board of directors. The numbers on the projection screen told a story of unprecedented growth, client acquisition up 40%, revenue increases that exceeded our most optimistic projections, and a strategic expansion into markets that had previously seemed impossible to penetrate. The Torres digital marketing client portfolio integration has exceeded all expectations, I reported to the board, my voice steady with the confidence that came from knowing I'd earned every word I was speaking. We've retained 92% of their former clients while implementing ethical business practices that have actually improved their satisfaction ratings. Board member Patricia Williams raised her hand. Rachel, can you elaborate on how you managed to maintain client relationships after their previous agency was connected to federal criminal charges? Transparency and competence, I replied, without hesitation. We contacted each client personally, explained the situation honestly, and demonstrated our ability to deliver superior results without the ethical compromises they'd unknowingly been supporting. Most of them were actually relieved to partner with an organization they could trust completely. The irony wasn't lost on me that Ryan's criminal enterprise had become the foundation for my legitimate success. His desperate attempts to maintain an appearance of prosperity through illegal means had connected him to clients who genuinely needed marketing services. When I took over those relationships with actual expertise and honest practices, the clients had responded with loyalty and increased investment. Adrian sat at the head of the conference table, listening to my presentation with the focused attention he brought to all important business discussions. Over the past 3 months, our professional partnership had evolved into something more complex and infinitely more rewarding than either of us had initially anticipated. We worked together with an intuitive understanding that made difficult projects feel effortless, and the respect between us had deepened into something that felt increasingly personal despite our careful maintenance of professional boundaries. "The success metrics speak for themselves," Adrian said as I concluded my presentation. "Rachel has not only met every goal we established, but has redefined what we thought was possible in strategic marketing. The board should also know that 3 major corporations have already approached us about poaching her services." "And our response to those approaches?" asked board member Jonathan Martinez, who despite sharing my last name was no relation, but had become something of a mentor over the past months. "We're promoting Rachel to Senior Director of Strategic Innovation with full autonomy over her division and equity participation that reflects her value to this organization," Adrian announced. "Anyone who wants to steal our talent will have to outbid partners rather than employers." The promotion wasn't entirely unexpected. My results had been building toward this recognition for weeks, but hearing it announced officially in front of the board created a surge of satisfaction that felt like validation for every risk I'd taken since that catastrophic wedding day. The title came with financial rewards that would make me independently wealthy within 2 years. But more importantly, it represented acknowledgement that I had become exactly the kind of professional I'd always dreamed of being. After the board meeting concluded, Adrian and I walked together toward his office, the familiar rhythm of our post-meeting debriefings feeling as natural as breathing. These conversations had become one of my favorite parts of the workday. Opportunities to process complex business decisions with someone who understood both the strategic and personal implications of our choices. "You looked surprised when I announced the promotion," Adrian observed as we settled into the comfortable chairs by his office windows. "Not surprised exactly. More like amazed that this is actually my life now," I said. 6 months ago, I was organizing wedding favors and worrying about seating charts. Today, I'm running a multi-million-dollar division of one of the most successful companies in the Midwest. "Do you miss it? The simplicity of your old life?" The question was more loaded than its casual tone suggested, and I took a moment to consider my answer carefully. Did I miss the security of having my future mapped out in conventional milestones? Did I miss believing that happiness could be achieved through following predetermined scripts about love and success? "I miss feeling like I understood the rules," I said finally. "But I don't miss living by rules that were never designed for someone like me. I don't miss making myself smaller to fit into spaces that weren't big enough for who I actually am." Adrian nodded, his expression suggesting he understood exactly what I meant. "I used to think that certainty was the most valuable thing you could have in life, knowing exactly what to expect, being able to predict and control outcomes. But uncertainty can be liberating if you're brave enough to embrace it. Is that what you did after your divorce? Embraced uncertainty?" "Eventually. At first, I tried to recreate the same kind of controlled environment I'd had before, just with different people. It took me a while to realize that the control had been an illusion all along, and that real security comes from trusting your ability to handle whatever happens, rather than trying to prevent anything from happening." The personal revelation created a moment of intimacy that had become increasingly common in our conversations. Over the past months, Adrian had gradually shared pieces of his story that revealed someone far more complex and thoughtful than his public reputation suggested. Behind the confident billionaire entrepreneur was someone who had learned wisdom through painful experience, someone who understood that success meant more than financial achievement. My phone buzzed with a text message, and I glanced down to see a name that made my stomach clench with familiar anger. Ryan Torres. After 3 months of federal court proceedings and plea negotiations, he was apparently ready to reach out from whatever minimum security facility had become his temporary home. "Let me guess," Adrian said, noting my expression. "Your ex-fiancé has something important to communicate from prison." I opened the message, reading Ryan's words with the detached interest of someone examining an artifact from a previous civilization. "He wants to see me. He says he's learned important things about himself and wants to apologize properly. He thinks we might be able to rebuild something meaningful together. After he pled guilty to money laundering and fraud to avoid a 20-year sentence, Adrian observed dryly. After he testified against his Meridian Holdings contacts to reduce his prison time to 18 months, I corrected. Apparently, federal incarceration has given him perspective on what really matters in life. And what does he think really matters? I read further into Ryan's message, my eyebrows rising as his romantic delusions became increasingly elaborate. According to this, our relationship was the only authentic thing in his life, and losing me made him realize that all his business success was meaningless without love. He's convinced that we were meant to be together and that his criminal activities were just a misguided attempt to build a life worthy of me. Adrian was quiet for a long moment, studying my face with an expression I couldn't quite interpret. How does that make you feel? Like I'm reading fiction written by someone who never understood the story he was actually living, I said without hesitation. Ryan still doesn't comprehend that his betrayal wasn't a mistake or a moment of weakness. It was the inevitable result of who he fundamentally is. He's not apologizing for lying to me. He's apologizing for getting caught. You've changed, Adrian said, and there was something like admiration in his voice. The woman I met 3 months ago might have been tempted to believe that people can transform themselves through dramatic gestures. That woman hadn't learned the difference between authentic change and performance designed to achieve specific goals, I replied. Ryan is still trying to manipulate outcomes through emotional manipulation. The only difference is that now, he's doing it from a federal prison. The insight felt like the final piece of a puzzle I'd been solving since the day Ryan abandoned me at the altar. For months, I'd been processing the betrayal as a personal failure, wondering what I could have done differently to prevent his deception. But sitting in Adrian's office, surrounded by evidence of the life I'd built from the ashes of that destruction, I finally understood that Ryan's choices had never been about me. They'd been about his fundamental inability to construct an authentic life based on genuine principles. Are you going to respond to his message? Adrian asked. I already did, I said, showing him the brief reply I'd typed. I wished him well in his rehabilitation and told him that I've moved on to a life that doesn't have space for people who proved they can't be trusted with important responsibilities. Adrian smiled, and there was something warm and approving in his expression that made my heart flutter in ways I was still learning to recognize. Direct and final. No room for misinterpretation. I learned from the best, I said, meeting his eyes with an acknowledgement that our professional relationship had taught me more than marketing strategy and business development. The moment stretched between us, loaded with the kind of tension that had been building for weeks, but had never been directly addressed. We'd been scrupulously professional in all our interactions, but underneath the business partnership was a personal connection that felt increasingly impossible to ignore. Adrian had become more than my mentor and employer. He'd become someone whose opinion mattered to me in ways that had nothing to do with career advancement. Rachel, Adrian said, his voice carrying a note of careful formality that suggested he was about to cross a line we'd both been avoiding. I need to tell you something, and I want you to feel completely free to maintain professional boundaries regardless of how you respond. My heart began beating faster, though I tried to keep my expression neutral. I'm listening. These past 3 months have been the most professionally satisfying of my career, but they've also been personally significant in ways I didn't expect. He paused, as if choosing his words with particular care. Working with you has reminded me what it feels like to have a true partner, someone who challenges me to be better while supporting my goals completely. The admission created a flutter of warmth in my chest, but I waited for him to continue rather than responding immediately. I know that workplace relationships can be complicated, and I would never want to jeopardize what we've built professionally, Adrian continued. But I also can't pretend that my feelings for you are entirely professional anymore. The honesty in his statement was both thrilling and terrifying. For months, I'd been wondering if the connection I felt with Adrian was one-sided, if I was reading personal interest into interactions that were simply the result of effective professional collaboration. Learning that he'd been experiencing the same tension felt like discovering that a secret I'd been keeping wasn't a secret at all. "Adrian," I said carefully, "are you saying that you're interested in exploring something personal between us?" "I'm saying that I care about you in ways that go far beyond business partnership. And if you feel the same way, I'd like to discover what that might look like." He leaned forward slightly, his green eyes holding mine with an intensity that made breathing difficult. "But I want you to know that regardless of your answer, nothing changes about our professional relationship. You've earned your position here through your own merit, and that's not dependent on anything personal between us." The consideration he was showing for my autonomy and professional security was so different from Ryan's approach to relationships that it felt like encountering an entirely new species of man. Ryan had always used emotional manipulation and implied threats to maintain control, making me feel like my choices were limited by his approval or disapproval. Adrian was offering me complete freedom to make my own decision while making it clear that my professional success was independent of any personal connection between us. "I do feel the same way," I said, my voice steadier than I'd expected. "I've been wondering for weeks if I was imagining the connection between us, or if it was something real that we were both too professional to acknowledge." Adrian's smile was brilliant, transforming his normally controlled expression into something radiantly happy. "You weren't imagining it. I've been fighting the urge to ask you to dinner since our second week working together. What stopped you?" "The same thing that's been stopping you, I imagine. The fear that mixing professional and personal relationships would complicate something that was working perfectly. I considered this, thinking about the careful balance we'd maintained and whether introducing romantic elements would enhance or threaten our professional partnership. With Ryan, my personal and professional lives had always been in conflict. He'd resented my career ambitions and made me feel guilty for prioritizing work over his emotional needs. But with Adrian, my professional growth had been encouraged and supported in ways that made me feel more authentically myself rather than less. "I think we're both mature enough to handle complexity," I said finally. "And I trust you enough to believe that you mean what you say about protecting our professional relationship. Then would you like to have dinner with me tonight? Somewhere that has nothing to do with business, where we can explore what it feels like to just be Adrian and Rachel rather than CEO and senior director?" The invitation felt like stepping off a cliff into free fall, but the kind of free fall that felt like flying rather than falling. I'd love that. As we made plans for dinner, my phone buzzed with another message, this one from Vanessa. I'd blocked her number months ago, but she'd apparently found a way around my restrictions. The message was brief and calculated to create maximum emotional impact. "I heard about your promotion. I always knew you were capable of more than Ryan appreciated. I hope we can talk sometime. I miss my best friend." I showed the message to Adrian, who read it with an expression of disgust. Manipulation disguised as reconciliation. She's probably realized that your success makes you a valuable contact for her PR firm. Probably. But it doesn't matter. Anymore, I said, deleting the message without responding. "I'm not interested in relationships with people who've proven they can't be trusted, regardless of what they might offer me now." "Another wise decision," Adrian said. "You've become remarkably good at recognizing authentic intentions versus calculated performance." As we prepared to leave the office for our dinner, I caught my reflection in the window and saw someone I barely recognized from 6 months earlier. The woman looking back at me had confidence that came from achievement rather than approval, security that was based on her own capabilities rather than someone else's promises, and the kind of quiet power that didn't need to announce itself because it was rooted in genuine competence. Ryan had thought he was escaping a commitment that would limit his freedom. Instead, He'd freed me to discover that I was capable of building a life far more extraordinary than anything he could have offered. His betrayal had been intended to diminish me, but it had actually revealed reserves of strength and ambition I'd never known I possessed. Walking out of Blackstone Enterprises with Adrian, heading toward a dinner that would mark the beginning of something entirely new, I felt like I was finally living the life I'd been meant to have all along. The abandoned bride had become someone who could never be abandoned again because she belonged entirely to herself and chose her connections from a position of strength rather than need. The story that had begun with betrayal and humiliation was becoming something far more beautiful, a love story between equals, built on mutual respect and shared ambition rather than desperation and compromise. And for the first time in my life, I was writing my own ending. The white sand beach in Santorini stretched endlessly before us, the azure waters of the Aegean Sea meeting the horizon in a line so perfect it looked painted against the sky. I stood at the edge of the cliff-top terrace, wearing a flowing ivory dress that caught the Mediterranean breeze, watching the sun begin its descent toward the water in shades of gold and coral that seemed too beautiful to be real. "Second thoughts?" Adrian asked, coming up behind me and wrapping his arms around my waist. His voice carried the hint of teasing that had become familiar over the past year, but underneath it was genuine concern, the kind of attentiveness that still surprised me with its constancy. "Never," I said, leaning back into his embrace and feeling the solid warmth of him against my spine. "I'm just thinking about how different this feels from the first time I tried to get married." The contrast was so stark, it felt like comparing two different lifetimes. 18 months ago, I'd been a woman who planned obsessively, who needed every detail controlled and predetermined to feel secure. Today, we'd flown to Greece on a whim after Adrian suggested we stop postponing happiness for the sake of perfect timing. The ceremony we were planning for tomorrow had been organized in 3 weeks, with nothing but trust and spontaneity guiding our decisions. "Tell me," Adrian said, his lips brushing against my ear in the way that always made my pulse quicken. That first wedding felt like a performance I was giving for other people. Like I was trying to convince everyone, including myself, that I was living the right kind of life. I turned in his arms to face him, noting how the golden hour light brought out the green flecks in his eyes. This feels like coming home to myself. The year since that dinner at the Italian restaurant downtown had been a masterclass in what partnership could look like when both people entered it from positions of strength rather than need. We'd navigated the complexities of combining romance with business collaboration, supporting each other's ambitions while maintaining our individual identities. Adrian had never asked me to diminish myself to accommodate his ego, and I'd never felt the urge to make myself smaller to fit into his world. The marketing division I'd built at Blackstone Enterprises had exceeded every projection, earning recognition from industry publications and attracting talent from competitors who wanted to work for an organization that valued innovation over convention. My success had opened doors I'd never imagined walking through, including speaking engagements at major conferences and consulting offers from Fortune 500 companies. But more importantly, it had given me the confidence to trust my own judgment in all areas of life, including love. "I got a text from Carmen this morning," I said, pulling out my phone to show Adrian the message. She said Ryan tried to contact her, asking for information about the wedding. Apparently, he heard through mutual friends that we were getting married and wanted to know when and where. Adrian's expression shifted to something harder, more protective. What did she tell him? Nothing. She blocked his number and sent me a screenshot of his message before deleting it. I smiled at the memory of my sister's fierce loyalty. She said anyone stupid enough to abandon me doesn't deserve updates about my happiness. The past year had brought various attempts from both Ryan and Vanessa to reinsert themselves into my life, each one more transparent than the last. Ryan's messages had evolved from prison cell apologies to bitter accusations that I'd stolen his business empire while he was temporarily indisposed. Vanessa had tried everything from professional networking requests to emotional manipulation disguised as concern for my well-being. I'd responded to none of them, understanding that engaging with people who'd proven their dishonesty was like feeding wild animals. It only encouraged them to keep coming back. The private investigator's final report came in yesterday, Adrian D. said, his tone becoming more businesslike. Ryan was released early for good behavior and cooperation with federal prosecutors, but he's under supervised probation for the next 3 years. He's working at a telemarketing company in Phoenix and living with his mother. The information should have produced some feeling, satisfaction, pity, vindication, but instead, it felt like hearing news about a stranger. Ryan Torres had become irrelevant to my life so completely that learning about his circumstances felt like reading about someone I'd never met. And Vanessa? Morrison & Associates terminated her employment 6 months ago when several clients requested new account representatives. She's freelancing now, but struggling to maintain the lifestyle she was accustomed to. Adrian paused, studying my face. Does knowing that make you feel better? It makes me feel grateful, I said, after considering the question. Not because they're struggling, but because their choices freed me to discover what I was actually capable of. If Ryan hadn't abandoned me, I might have spent decades in a marriage that kept me small and safe. If Vanessa hadn't betrayed me, I might never have learned to trust my own instincts about people. So they accidentally did you the greatest favor of your life? They forced me to save myself, which turned out to be the most important skill I could develop. As the sun continued its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in increasingly dramatic shades of orange and pink, I thought about the woman I'd been when this story began. She'd been so afraid of uncertainty, so invested in other people's approval, so convinced that security came from following predetermined scripts about how life was supposed to unfold. The woman I'd become understood that real security came from trusting your ability to handle whatever happened, and that the best life wasn't the safest one. It was the one that challenged you to become your fullest self. I have something for you, Adrian said, reaching into his jacket pocket and pulling out a small velvet box that made my heart skip despite my certainty about our future together. I know we're getting married tomorrow, but I wanted to give this to you privately first. Inside the box was a ring unlike anything I'd ever seen, a vintage Art Deco piece with a center diamond surrounded by intricate metalwork that looked like it had been crafted by someone who understood that true beauty came from complexity rather than size. It was elegant without being ostentatious, distinctive without being flashy, and absolutely perfect in ways that my original engagement ring from Ryan had never been. It belonged to my grandmother, Adrian said as he slipped it onto my finger, with hands that were surprisingly steady. She wore it for 63 years of marriage to a man who never stopped seeing her as his equal partner. I've been saving it for someone who understood that love isn't about possession or control. It's about choosing each other every day from a place of freedom rather than obligation. The ring fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting for my finger all along. But more than the physical beauty of the piece, I was moved by the story it represented, a legacy of partnership between people who'd built something lasting through mutual respect and genuine affection. Adrian, I said, my voice catching slightly on his name. I love you in ways I didn't know were possible. Not because you saved me from Ryan's betrayal, but because you helped me save myself. Not because you gave me opportunities I couldn't have earned alone, but because you recognized abilities I didn't know I had and encouraged me to use them. That's the only kind of love worth having, he replied, cupping my face in his hands with the gentle reverence he'd shown me from our very first conversation. Love that makes you more yourself rather than less. As we kissed on the terrace, overlooking the Aegean Sea, with the Greek sunset painting everything in shades of gold and possibility, I felt like I was sealing a promise that went far beyond marriage vows. I was committing to a life of continued growth, mutual challenge, and the kind of partnership that created space for both people to flourish, rather than requiring one person to diminish themselves for the other's comfort. The small wedding ceremony. The next day was everything my first attempted wedding hadn't been: intimate instead of performative, focused on genuine emotion rather than impressive displays, attended by people who actually cared about our happiness rather than their own. Social status. Carmen stood beside me as my maid of honor, tears streaming down her face as she watched me marry someone who'd proven he understood my worth. My parents had flown in from Phoenix, my father beaming with pride as he walked me down the simple aisle we'd created on the beach, my mother clutching tissues and whispering in Spanish about how beautiful everything was. Adrian's best man was his younger brother Marcus, a surgeon from Boston who'd initially been skeptical about our whirlwind romance, but had been won over by witnessing how we brought out the best in each other. The small group of guests included colleagues who'd become genuine friends, family members who'd supported us through the dramatic early days of our relationship, and a few carefully chosen friends who understood that true celebrations were about substance rather than spectacle. The ceremony itself was brief but meaningful, with vows we'd written ourselves that spoke to partnership rather than possession, growth rather than stasis, and the kind of love that enhanced individual strength rather than requiring its sacrifice. When the officiant pronounced us married, the kiss we shared tasted like sea salt and promise, like the beginning of an adventure we'd navigate together as equals. The reception was held at a small taverna overlooking the water, with local musicians providing entertainment and fresh seafood that had been caught that morning. Instead of elaborate centerpieces and coordinated linens, we had simple white flowers and candles that flickered in the evening breeze. The atmosphere was relaxed and joyful, filled with the kind of laughter that comes from people who are genuinely happy to be together, rather than fulfilling social obligations. "I have an announcement," Adrian said as we raised glasses of local wine for the traditional toasts. Rachel and I have decided to expand Blackstone Enterprises' European operations, which means we'll be spending significant time in locations like this one. We're not just celebrating our marriage tonight, we're celebrating the launch of an international business adventure that will challenge us professionally while allowing us to explore the world together. The news was met with cheers and excited. Questions about our expansion plans. Over the past months, we'd been quietly researching opportunities in Mediterranean markets, identifying ways to leverage our combined expertise in new environments that would stretch our capabilities while strengthening our partnership. The decision to base part of our operations in Europe had been motivated by business considerations, but also by our shared desire to continue growing together rather than settling into comfortable routines. "What about the Chicago operations?" asked Jennifer Walsh, Adrian's legal counsel who'd become one of my closest friends over the past year. "The beauty of modern technology is that we can maintain our Midwest client base while expanding internationally," I replied. "The marketing strategies that work in Chicago aren't necessarily applicable in Athens or Barcelona, but the fundamental principles of understanding your audience and delivering value remain constant regardless of geography." As the evening progressed and our guests mingled on the terrace overlooking the darkening sea, I found myself in conversation with Carmen, who'd been watching the proceedings with the satisfied expression of someone whose predictions had been proven correct. "Do you remember what you said to me the night before your first wedding attempt?" she asked, refilling her wine glass from the bottle we'd been sharing. "I said a lot of things that night. Most of them wrong, as it turned out. You said you hoped you were making the right choice, that you felt like you were following a script someone else had written for your life." Carmen smiled, gesturing toward Adrian, who was deep in animated conversation with my father about sustainable business practices. "Tonight, you look like someone who's writing her own story." "Tonight, I am someone who's writing her own story," I corrected. "The difference between this wedding and the one that never happened isn't just that I'm marrying a different man. It's that I'm a different woman, One who knows her own worth and chooses her partnerships from a position of strength rather than need. What do you think would have happened if Ryan hadn't abandoned you? If you'd gone through with that first wedding? The question was one I'd pondered occasionally over the past months, usually late at night when my mind wandered through alternative timelines and imagined scenarios. I think we would have been miserable within 2 years and divorced within 5. I would have spent decades trying to fix a relationship that was fundamentally broken instead of building something genuine with someone who actually wanted to be my partner. So Ryan accidentally did you the greatest favor of your life? Ryan forced me to discover that I didn't need saving. I needed awakening. There's a difference between someone rescuing you from a bad situation and someone helping you recognize that you have the power to create better situations for yourself. As the evening wound down and our guests began filtering back to their hotels, Adrian and I walked alone along the beach, our bare feet sinking into sand that was still warm from the day's sunshine. The Mediterranean stars were brilliant overhead, unmarred by the light pollution that made Chicago's night sky seem dim by comparison. "Do you ever wonder what our life will look like in 10 years?" I asked, intertwining my fingers with his as we strolled along the water's edge. "I wonder, but I don't worry," Adrian replied. "I know that whatever challenges we face, we'll handle them together. I know that whatever opportunities arise, we'll evaluate them based on whether they help us grow individually and as a couple. I know that we'll keep choosing each other not because we have to, but because we want to." That's a very confident prediction for someone who's been married for approximately 6 hours. It's not a prediction, it's a commitment. The same commitment I made when I stood up there and promised to be your partner in all things, not just the easy ones. We stopped walking and turned to face each other, the moonlight reflecting off the water behind us, creating an almost ethereal backdrop for what felt like a moment of perfect clarity. In Adrian's face, I saw the future I wanted to create, challenging, unpredictable, filled with growth and adventure, and the kind of love that enhanced rather than diminished both participants. "I love you, Mrs. Blackstone," he said, using my new name with obvious satisfaction. "I love you too, Mr. Blackstone. Thank you for helping me become someone brave enough to deserve this happiness." "You always deserved it, Rachel. You just needed to believe it yourself." As we walked back toward the small resort where we'd spend our wedding night before flying to Rome for a honeymoon that would combine business meetings with romantic exploration, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment. 18 months ago, I'd been a woman who defined herself through other people's needs and expectations, who measured success by how well she could accommodate and please rather than how authentically she could live. The abandoned bride had become a woman who could never be abandoned because she belonged entirely to herself. The betrayal that was meant to destroy me had instead revealed strengths I'd never known I possessed. The humiliation that should have made me smaller had actually forced me to grow into the person I'd always had the potential to become. Ryan Torres had thought he was escaping a commitment that would limit his freedom. Instead, he'd freed me, to discover that real freedom came not from avoiding responsibility, but from choosing it wisely. He'd handed me the keys to destroy his empire, while simultaneously giving me the opportunity to build something far more extraordinary than anything he could have offered. The woman who had once worried about wedding favors and seating charts was now the co-owner of an international business empire, married to a man who saw her as an equal partner rather than a beautiful accessory. The future stretched ahead of us like an unwritten book, full of blank pages waiting to be filled with adventures we'd choose together. Standing on the terrace of our honeymoon suite, looking out over the Greek islands dotting the dark sea like scattered jewels, I understood that this wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of the chapter I'd always been meant to write. The abandoned bride had become someone who could never be abandoned again, because she'd learned the most important lesson of all. The only person who could truly save you was yourself. And once you understood that, you became unstoppable. That betrayal had been intended to break me. Instead, it had taught me to build something unbreakable from the fragments of my former life. And as Adrian joined me on the terrace, wrapping his arms around me as we watched the stars reflect in the water below, I knew that the best part of my story was just beginning. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.